My name is Tony Earnshaw, and in 2005 I wrote a book called Beating the Devil, The Making of Night of the Demon. The film starts with those ancient stones at Stonehenge and the opening narration provided by an Irish actor called Shay Gorman, and in this British version of the film it runs slightly longer than the American Curse of the Demon. Night of the Demon has been described as the Casablanca of horror films. And what initially seemed like a routine project managed to catch many brilliant and skilled people at the right time and place in their careers, and although not without friction, managed to ultimately create a supreme classic of its genre. And I'll discuss more about the making of the film as it unfolds. I first saw this movie when I was a teenager. I would have been 14, and I saw it as part of a BBC double bill in the summer of 1980, and it had a huge effect on me, and it's something that I've never forgotten. So Columbia Pictures Corporation presents a Sabre film production, Sabre Films being the production company of the American Hal Chester and his British counterpart Frank Beavis. Both men had been in movies for many years when they partnered on what was originally known as The Haunted. Chester had been an actor, one of Universal's little tough guys. And as a producer, his credits included The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, with stop-motion animation by Ray Harryhausen, School for Scoundrels with Alistair Sim, Ian Carmichael and Terry Thomas, and The Double Man with Yul Brynner. Beavis had worked his way through the industry and had been an assistant director and a production manager. And after ceasing work as a producer, he became an associate producer and latterly a production supervisor on films such as the Internecine Project. Beavis is only credited in the UK print of the film. He appears nowhere in Curse of the Demon credits at all. The screenplay is attributed to Charles Bennett and Hal Chester. Charles Bennett's 137-page original was largely discarded, and Hal Chester wrote very little. In truth, the script was rewritten by Cy Endfield, the Pennsylvania-born writer-director who had been blacklisted since the HUAC period and Hollywood's crackdown on communism, and found himself scratching a living in the UK. So the film begins with a car speeding through the darkness, and it's very reminiscent of those black and white horror movies of the 1940s made by Val Lewton at RKO, because, of course, the director of Night of the Demon was Jacques Tourneur, who came through as one of the stable of directors at RKO working for Lewton. And there's a great deal of Val Lewton's influence and style to be seen in Night of the Demon, and it's clear from the research I've done that Tourneur wanted to make that subtle, understated type of film, relying on his talent at creating atmosphere. What he didn't expect, of course, was to be almost hamstrung by his producers. Tourneur was a highly versatile director, equally adept at westerns and thrillers as he was making horror films. But here, he wasn't dealing with the sympathetic and empathetic Lewton. Frank Beavis, the producer, told me in an interview that the kids expect a monster, and they were making a monster movie. Here we have the film's first character, Henry Harrington, played by Maurice Denham, coming to the mansion owned by Professor Julian Karswell, played by Niall McGuinness. The house is Lufford Hall, which is actually Brocket Hall in Hertfordshire, an 18th century house in extensive grounds which is now a conference centre. What we're seeing here is actually a set. The production design for Night of the Demon was by Ken Adam, who would later go on to design many of the Bond movies, including Goldfinger, as well as Dr. Strangelove for Stanley Kubrick. And Ken told me in an interview for my book that all interiors seen in the film were built in the studio at ABPC, which is Associated British Pictures Corporation at Elstree.
Good evening.
Good evening.
There's a whole backstory to Night of the Demon that would lend itself to a prequel, using many of the same characters. We know very little about Julian Karswell, other than what's in M.R. James's original story, Casting the Runes. And indeed, Charles Bennett's original script, The Bewitched, takes the premise of James's tale and uses it to set up his version of the story, which sets Holden on a collision course with Karswell after he cruelly critiqued his book. And that story is one of simple revenge. What becomes clear here from the outset is that Karswell is nervous. He rapidly gets rid of Harrington because he can't be anywhere near him. Why? Because Karswell has set something in motion that cannot be stopped. For all of the controversy about the presentation of the demon in the film, the scale of it serves a crucial dramatic purpose. In the original story, the summoned demon is sprite-like. It scares one victim until he unsuccessfully climbs a tree and breaks his neck, terrifies Charles Dunning by taking form underneath his pillow, and ultimately kills Karswell by striking his head with a dislodged stone from a church tower. It's almost discreet in how it conducts itself. Karswell's fear here makes no sense if the demon isn't big enough to engulf almost everything in its path. He knows he needs to keep a large distance. Now, the special effects team that worked on Night of the Demon did so when it was known as The Haunted, which was the title with which it went into production on the 19th of November 1956, coincidentally the same day as Hammer's The Curse of Frankenstein. That team included Brian Langley, John Mackey, Bob Cuff, and Brian Loftus, and the team was headed up by Wally Vivers, one of the great British special effects artists. John Mackey referred to their work on Night of the Demon as a hospital job, in that they were brought in at short notice to deliver effects that the key crew had been unable to do satisfactorily. And according to the special effects team, the demon was made on a very small budget, as dictated by Hal Chester. And Mackey bluntly described Chester to me as a cheapskate. And what we see here is a cloud effect made by dropping emulsion paint into water and filming the bubbling effect at a very high speed, and then combining it with the smoky haze created by titanium chloride when it's exposed to the air. When I wrote to Maurice Denham, he was living in a nursing home and was in his early 90s. His letter to me was succinct, and he said, "My one memory of Night of the Demon is driving in the dark into power cables and being killed." But what a dramatic exit. And there's the close-up, the snarl, and of course we saw what one of the special effects team referred to as a hoof on a stick, a very simple effect which was added on as a mat. Jacques Tourneur always claimed that the demon had been inserted into the film after he'd finished work on it and against his wishes, and he said it cheapened the film. And Dana Andrews, who didn't get on with Hal Chester at all, backed him up in that regard. But Tourneur's stance is not necessarily true. The demon was always in the script and through multiple drafts, and I know that because I have a copy of the shooting script, and I also spoke to the assistant director Basil Keyes, who confirmed that the demon was there from the get-go. So what's more likely is that much more was made of the demon than Tourneur was comfortable with or had envisaged or assumed would be present in the picture. And it's also been suggested that the changes were driven by Mike Frankovich, who was Columbia's head of production in the UK at the time and obviously the film's distributor. And if he was unhappy with what he saw in the rushes, he could have compelled Chester and Beavis to make changes or risk losing their distribution. Now, Dana Andrews was, of course, an American actor, and so Sabre Film Productions were doing what Hammer had done in their early Quatermass films in the 1950s, in importing an American star. Now, Andrews was not an A-lister in the mode of Clark Gable or Gary Cooper, but he was someone who was familiar and popular with American audiences, and so he comes in as the hero. And his character in the film is in fact a holdover from Charles Bennett's original script, though in that he's an athletic, golf-playing academic in his 30s, and in actual fact, in real life, Dana Andrews was almost 50. And Andrews, of course, was cast by Jacques Tourneur himself. He wanted someone that he knew and could work with, and with whom he had an existing relationship. And the first person Dana meets on his flight to London is Joanna Harrington, the niece of the dead Professor Henry Harrington. Joanna was Charles Bennett's invention, though in his script she's Henry's sister, and what does remain the same is the dynamic between Holden and Joanna and their burgeoning romance. Prior to the start of shooting, the producers hosted a launch event in which Dana Andrews was presented to the press. One of the guests was the nonagenarian Dr. Margaret Murray, the anthropologist, folklorist, Egyptologist and witchcraft historian. And Dr. Murray was famous for developing a witch cult theory that claimed European witches had followed a definite religion. And there exists a very strange photograph of Andrews and Murray together in which he appears to be holding up her chin so that he can kiss her for the cameras. What they were seeking to do was give the film some added clout by claiming that they'd done their research. Now, whether that stemmed from Bennett's original script or whether it was something Cy Enfield had suggested, I don't know. But certainly the notion of a Karswell devil cult appears in the shooting script, which lends itself to an idea created by Enfield. And in terms of the press, of course, putting Andrews alongside such a venerable figure gave the project some added wallop. Dana Andrews plays Holden as a rather hard-nosed skeptic, and indeed Cy Enfield's take on the script is altogether straighter than Bennett's The Bewitched, which he himself described as a light-hearted dramatic excursion into what might or might not be the supernatural. Of course, Holden is a rational man who debunks things, a little like Houdini debunked spiritualism in the 1920s. He's made his living and his reputation on that basis, pricking the bubble of artifice that surrounds so many of these people. But Karswell, as we have seen, is not a fake. So the film sets up the key premise, which is that we all know, as the audience, that Karswell is the real deal, and the thrill of the movie is in large part watching Holden's awareness grow.
You were saying Professor Harrington couldn't come.
Yes, I'm afraid I have some terrible news for you. Professor Harrington was found dead this morning.
Found dead?
Now, here we have the introduction of the villain by Mark O'Brien, another academic played by the magnificent Irish actor Liam Redmond. And he's at the top of a tremendous ensemble of character players. Almost the entirety of the film's cast came through the ABPC casting office run by Robert Leonard, a veteran casting director who worked on many British movies of that period, one of them being The Dam Busters. The majority of the people in this film within the ensemble, so Liam Redmond, Peter Elliott, Lloyd Lamble, Richard Leach, Brian Wilde, Rosamund Greenwood, Reginald Beckwith, and even Peggy Cummins and Athene Seiler were all cast by Bob Leonard. And in that respect, it was a traditional studio picture. A modest budget, almost entirely British, and shot on location. So, here's a quick background on the origins of the project. The film began in 1954 when Charles Bennett secured the rights to M.R. James's Casting the Runes and wrote a script entitled The Bewitched on spec, which was picked up by independent producer Marcel Hellman. This features certain things taken directly from James's original story that didn't make it into the final script and film, such as Harrington's death at the beginning, occurring on the way home from the pub, as he's chased by something horrifying and unseen through the woods until he climbs a tree to escape and falls to his death. And the main plot being set in motion once Holden writes a scathing review of Karswell's book on witchcraft and demonology. The aim of Hellman was to get an A certificate from the BBFC to make the film accessible to teenage audiences, lessening the horror by inserting comic interludes to do with dotty mothers and Holden's passion for golf tournaments. This tactic is not as strange as it might sound. A direct precedent was Ealing's classic horror anthology film Dead of Night in 1945, which also broke up its scares by having the penultimate story presenting a much lighter tone, and it included a comedy golfing sequence, and it received an A. However, stories about ghosts were held in very different stead from stories about contemporary devil cults, and they were told an X was inevitable. Some of the most intriguing elements that the BBFC objected to were a painting depicting a black mass, and Holden's hand touching what seems to be a cat, but whose back seems to have no end. And one BBFC examiner's judgment of the script ended with, "I find the elaborately contrived, supposedly supernatural hokum most repulsive. In some way I cannot define, it savours to me of blasphemy that normal adults should go about in fear of their lives over runic spells in this 20th century. Perhaps I am unduly prejudicial." And even in this draft, the monster is described as being a kind of huge, ghostly dinosaur, not clearly seen, though its panting is heard, and a painting of it is seen at Karswell's. However, Hellman was not interested in making an X certificate film, so Bennett's script then started to do the rounds in Hollywood. Anyway, back to the film. Niall McGuinness was a veteran character actor with a chunky track record of movies from the mid-1930s onwards. He'd worked with Michael Powell and Laurence Olivier. He would play the lead in Martin Luther, and later he would be Zeus in Jason and the Argonauts. And he was a tremendous actor with great gravitas. He didn't often get a chance to show how good he was, but here he has as much weight on screen as Dana Andrews, and to my mind, he dominates the film. It's worth pointing out that Karswell was written with the actor Francis L. Sullivan in mind, and it's unclear if he was ever approached or just a preference of Charles Bennett, but in a remarkable coincidence, Sullivan died the day filming began. Orson Welles was also mentioned, and Robert Cummings might have been Holden, with Glynis Johns as Joanna. The British Museum here is obviously a very real building in London and a very real location. And this is the first location I spotted that made me want to write my book, Beating the Devil. And in this high establishing shot, Dana Andrews is walking into the reading room via the King's Library. We'll see John Salew now as the librarian, a very familiar face from British movies, especially from this period, and he gives a very crisp and brisk characterization. And there's also the sense here that the British Museum has access to some fairly dangerous books, which has always been actually a persistent urban legend.
Yes, I know.
Seems to be missing. Most peculiar. I'm having it checked.
It was mentioned in these research notes. Never mind, I can probably find what I want in these.
I hope so, sir. Do my best to trace it. Excuse me, sir. I couldn't help but...
And here we have Karswell in person. There's a wonderful sense that Karswell can turn, that he can switch from this faux, ingratiating, cajoling manner to a real mood of menace. And there is a real sense of genuine menace in Niall McGuinness. The interaction, the body language as he leans in is almost predatory, looming over the sitting figure of John Holden. And the music heralds the change in mood and the growing dread. This is the casting of the runes. Clifton Parker's score is both subtle and scary. It's a key moment in the film, and the music underlines it perfectly. And this is pure Turner. The subtlety that he wanted to infuse in the film is evident and very potent. The scene is beautifully composed of blacks and greys and whites, and it's a testament to the skills of the cinematographer Ted Scaife. Ted Scaife had a very long and distinguished career. Born in 1912, he worked his way up the ranks of various camera departments, and he learned from the true masters. He was the camera operator on films such as Black Narcissus and The Third Man. Once he made the transition to being a full-blown lighting cameraman, he worked more than once with both Carol Reed and John Huston, and on numerous fascinating films, including All Night Long, The Dirty Dozen, Play Dirty, Hanny Calder, and Sitting Target. His versatility comes brilliantly into play in Night of the Demon. It offers subtly off-kilter atmosphere during the daytime and in interiors, and extraordinarily complex use of darkness and shadow in the night scenes. The masterful simplicity of Turner's setups, combined with the intricacy of Scaife's lighting, layers the film with the ongoing sense of two worlds coexisting, something sinister continually infiltrating the everyday. But back to the story behind the film. After Bennett's initial producers decided to leave the project after they realised an A certificate in Britain wasn't an option, the script went around Hollywood. Both Robert Taylor and Dick Powell were interested in the project as actor-producers. Dick Powell never quite made it to the contract signing stage, but Taylor apparently managed to set up a deal at RKO. But the way Charles Bennett told it, before he was aware of this, Hal Chester approached him in London as Bennett was setting off to catch a plane to America. And he assured Bennett that he could set up the project at Columbia and got Bennett's signature on a contract there and then. 2 days later, he was contacted by Robert Taylor to let him know the deal at RKO had been greenlit for Bennett to direct his own script, but it was too late. The project was now in the hands of Chester and Beavis, and that was that. Chester then brought on Cy Enfield, who he'd been friends with for over a decade, to start work on a new draft. Bennett's script was much more suggestive and subtle. Hal Chester described it as too English. The revisions they now started to employ removed the comedy aspects of the script. Chester also insisted on the addition of the 40-foot fire demon at the beginning and the end to make the film more marketable. So Enfield's version is crafted around this dynamic. We know the demon, and subsequently Karswell's threats, are the real deal from the start. So the suspense is doubled across the film as we await both Holden's appointment with the demon and for Holden to catch up to the dire reality of his situation. And the idea that the demon was inserted during post-production and upset the dramatic intent of the film Turner thought he was making actually couldn't be further from the truth. Enfield was not particularly well treated by Chester, who knew he could more or less exploit him given his blacklisted status and need for employment of any kind. On other projects, Enfield used a variety of pseudonyms, including Hugh Raker and Jonathan Roach. And on this film, Enfield used Chester's name as a beard, possibly because he was working on a low-budget supernatural picture for which he had very little interest. And many of the deeper, darker elements of the script were added by Enfield. Being a victim of the Red Scare in Hollywood, it's hard to see how, even if he wasn't a horror fan, the film's mood of dread and atmosphere of sinister forces closing in inexorably on a lone man couldn't have had some personal resonance. Now, Enfield's luck was soon to change. The very next year, in 1957, the British action drama Hell Drivers, which he directed and co-wrote, was released under his name to great acclaim and box office success, and he even received a BAFTA nomination for Best Screenplay. He went on to direct other classics, including Mysterious Island and, of course, the iconic Zulu, though he never worked in America again. And the decision of Chester and Beavis going unabashedly for an X certificate was also quite a bold choice. The X certificate had only been introduced in 1951 and was something many distributors were still very wary of. And it was the first time a certificate had an attached age restriction, so under 16s were not permitted in, which is not what any maker of a monster movie wants to hear. Some independent producers realised the possible publicity element of this X certificate, especially as it still carried with it an unseemly air. And even in the days before they struck gold with horror, Hammer Films were almost unique in actively pursuing X certificates with films such as X the Unknown and the Quatermass Experiment, foregrounding the certificate in their titles and advertising. And in a final round of discussions with the BBFC over the script, the final elements that had to be excised were a painted depiction of a black mass in Karswell's home, which doesn't appear in the film, and a toning down of Rand Hobart's praise of devil worship while under hypnosis, which we'll talk about more when we come to it. The final script feedback from the BBFC was received on Halloween 1956, and the film, now entitled The Haunted, was ready for filming. Peggy tends to get overlooked, but she has a huge part to play in the film. It's very male-dominated, and it's only really her, Athene Seiler, and Rosamund Greenwood as Mrs. Meek. And when I interviewed her about her experiences on the film, she said this: "You can't do something and try and be realistic about it and think it's hokum. While you're doing it, you have to try to get the gut feeling. But I think one probably did think the runes were a bit silly. You've got to convince your public, haven't you? You're being paid to do a job." Dana was a very convincing actor, as were Maurice Denham and the others. And she has a great line in this scene, very well delivered. "They believe in things in the dark until we tell them it's not true. Maybe we've been fooling them." There's some very smart writing at the heart of this movie that comes from Bennett via Chester to Enfield. It's intelligent, it's precise, and it never mocks its audience. It never shortchanges people. And just like Hammer, and actors like Peter Cushing, who played Frankenstein and Van Helsing as if he was acting in Shakespeare, he played for real. He played them for keeps, never winking to the audience and never sending it up. He believed in it, and that same attitude applies to the acting in Night of the Demon. When I was researching Beating the Devil in the early 2000s, I visited several of the key locations with my friend and photographer Jim Moran. And we went to the very front of the house and stood at the balustrade that you see in the movie. To give some detail, when Holden and Joanna drive over the bridge, it takes them to the front of the house. But when Henry Harrington arrived, he came in through the back and past the gatepost featuring the strange statues holding the severed hands. So Turner shot from different perspectives, but still arrived at the same destination. And very little has changed. The exterior of the house is exactly as it was in 1956-57. And the hall is featured in other films. They include Omen 3: The Final Conflict, Highlander, and Willow. One of the changes to Bennett's script comes with the children's party, hosted by Karswell. Charles Bennett's version involved a rabbit in a hat, which becomes a snake with which he frightens the children, and was one of the elements singled out for criticism in the BBFC's examination of the earlier script. And in the movie, he has become Dr. Bobo, the huckster. And Karswell admits that he once made his living in this manner. And this is the key element of the backstory that we never get to see. In the past, he stumbled across something that he has exploited and can control, but he can only control it so far. Bennett's scene is an equivalent to the incident in Casting the Runes when Karswell terrifies the local children with a gruesomely realistic magic lantern show. And in Cy Enfield's rewrite, he's much more avuncular and friendly, and he seems to genuinely enjoy entertaining the children. And is this one of the only links he has to his former life before black magic and the runes entered into it? This scene in its entirety is fascinating, and it's really the only time we see Karswell relaxed and in his element. In Casting the Runes, Karswell is vain, egotistical, and utterly ruthless. His influence is everywhere. The Karswell in Night of the Demon is equally as ruthless, but one believes he feels compelled to allow his detractors as much leeway as possible before finally, and perhaps reluctantly, he casts the runes to silence them. The inference is that Karswell is secretly terrified and ruled by the powers that he's accumulated, that he began as a conjurer and gradually discovered ancient powers that seduced him into a world from which he can now never escape. And like Dr. Faustus, he sold his soul, if not literally, then at least metaphorically. Bennett's script infers that he is as much slave as master, but also a pillar of the community, ideally placed to coerce, recruit, and create disciples. Thus the root of an evil lies at the very heart of rural society, master manipulating serf even unto death. The snakes and ladders exchange is lifted almost word for word from Bennett's original script, and it remains heavy with malevolence. McGuinness brings a Shakespearean rigour and discipline to the delivery of his lines. The implicit threat in the line is almost brisk, and he has great gravitas. In many ways they are vastly different actors, one rooted in theatre, the other in film. We believe Karswell is a quintessential English villain, yet he's played by an Irish actor. McGuinness and Andrews are very different in style and looks. McGuinness is thick-set, a chunky man, not bulbous, as in James's story. Dana is very trim, and as Holden very dapper. He looks every inch of the leading man. He looks like a movie star.
Do you? Do I believe in witchcraft? What kind of witchcraft? The legendary witch that rides on the imaginary broom, the hex that tortures the thoughts of the victim, the pin stuck in the image that wastes away the mind and the body.
Also imaginary.
But where does imagination end and reality begin? What is this twilight, this half-world of the mind that you profess to know so much about? How can we differentiate between the powers of darkness and the powers of the mind?
The masked boys coming out from behind the tree may count as one of the first of a number of bussers in the film. When Jacques Tourneur was making movies for Val Lewton in the 1940s, he invented a shock effect. And there's a famous sequence in Cat People in which a bus comes along and sounds its air brakes to make an unexpected shock noise to startle the audience. Jump scares are a consistent feature of horror nowadays, but very few, if any, have Tourneur's hair's breadth timing and skill at misdirecting the audience leading up to them. Again, this is one of the most telling scenes in the film. His reaction to two boys just jumping out from behind a tree doesn't suggest a man willingly and enthusiastically devoting his life to cruelty and evil. Ultimately, the Black Magician serves a darker, higher master. Karswell's astounding and, up to this point, largely hidden powers are about to be powerfully illustrated to, as he says, make my point. The windstorm was created by drafting in giant turbines, something else that Tourneur claimed he had to fight for. The producers offered him 2, but he fought for and won 4. And they would set up 4 World War II airplanes without wings, secure them to the ground and rev up the engines. And in front of them would be a truck filled with dead leaves and rattan garden furniture placed off camera, which would all fly across the frame for each take. It adds tremendous impact to the scene, aided and abetted by the stillness of Niall McGuinness, which to my mind is extremely creepy. Poor kids, the party's ruined, everyone runs inside, and some of the kids are hit by the furniture. There's no health and safety considerations here. And as they get inside the house and shut out the storm, Karswell offers Holden a drink. The avuncular killer villain. It's a brilliant set piece, and once they get into the drawing room, notice how Tourneur enlivens and lifts what could be a slightly flat and stagey dialogue exchange by giving the actors physical business to keep them occupied, which is completely natural. First, he gives McGuinness the business of fixing Andrews a drink. Then McGuinness will methodically remove his clown makeup throughout the next patch of dialogue. And by this method, McGuinness has literally removed his mask to give Andrews the unvarnished truth about his predicament. It's simultaneously a completely legitimate metaphor and a totally concrete action within the scene, and is the sort of thing a brilliant director can add to a production. And when he turns around to face him directly, it carries a real charge, especially with the swirling leaves behind him, implying the kind of chaos Andrews' character is facing. Andrews remains confidently still throughout the scene, with McGuinness's petulant frustration making it a real effort for him to remain still. And what I like about this exchange, and the reason why I love McGuinness's performance and characterization, is that he's genuinely giving our hero an out. Yes, it's a threat, and it's almost a wheedling threat, but he's giving him an opportunity to step away and save his life. One can imagine this same conversation taking place with Professor Harrington. The out is not stated, but we have to assume that on some level it's for him to pass the rooms on to somebody else. Now, this is the first scene in which we get an idea that Mrs. Karswell knows more than she's letting on, and that her son has figured that out too. Preferring, or at least pretending, to ignore rather than acknowledge the dark forces that rule her son's life, she presents the ideal partner for Karswell to dominate. She appears to offer her son the neutrality and unconditional love of the blinkered parent, behind which he's free to carry on his wicked deeds, secure in the belief that she will never chastise, interfere with, or betray him. But her efforts to show Joanna the old book of spells, and later on in desperation the setting up of the seance with Mr. Meek the medium, reveal her to be much more aware than anyone else of the evil her son is practicing, and which is rapidly spiralling out of control. Athene Seiler, who plays Mrs. Karswell, was one of Britain's finest comic actresses. Born in 1889, she was 67 when she made Night of the Demon, but she would live for another 34 years, dying at the age of 101. Now, she worked mostly on the stage, but she had some very memorable film roles, including a part in another British horror classic, Thorold Dickinson's 1949 film, The Queen of Spades. And she was pretty much revered among the profession. In 1950, she was elected both lifelong president of the Theatrical Ladies Guild and the president of the Council of RADA, and she was made a CBE in 1959. And at the age of 99, in 1988, she was on Desert Island Discs and spoke delightfully about her career. What we're watching now is, to my mind, the key scene in the film, Karswell's nothing for nothing speech. And this manages to spell out key points of the backstory while simultaneously raising just as many questions. Karswell makes plain here how trapped he is, and it may be the BBFC's constant insistence at script stage that any instructive detail around the rites of black magic and devil worship be removed that's made the film that much more ambiguous and disturbing. Everything around Karswell's cult and whatever transactional qualities his initial bargain may have had is somewhat oblique and obscured, and that line to his mother, "I must protect myself because if it's not somebody else's life, it'll be mine," hints that he's opened a Pandora's box. He lets the genie out of the bottle and he can put it back in, but only once it's taken a life. So he has some control and some power, but he hasn't quite figured out how to harness it completely and safely for himself. When the demon appears, it's got no subjective stance. It's not a being that can be reasoned with. Instead, having been summoned, it must be sated. And Rand Hobart, the simple farmer who saved his own life by returning his parchment to the giver, grasped that fundamental concept but lost his mind in doing so. Is Hobart's condition due to guilt, or a mental collapse under the terrifying strain of knowing he'd been chosen, or is it something else to keep him from speaking? And what we have here is the beginnings of a romance, introduced by Cy Enfield in his script. It's fairly subtle, it's not overplayed, and with a 16-year age gap between Dana, born in 1909, and Peggy, born in 1925. Dana was close on 50. Peggy was in her early 30s, and the romance doesn't really appear in Bennett's script, which had more of a focus on comedy as a counterpoint to the main action. This sequence is a brilliant example of Turner's control of atmosphere, using nothing other than an empty corridor, some sound effects, and weird music. And it's interesting that the film opts for such high-pitched music and squeaking noises to imply a supernatural presence, whereas you might normally expect lower growling and rumbling, given the fiery demon we've already seen. But it's immensely unsettling. And in a 1965 interview with Sight and Sound, when he was already semi-retired, Turner described himself in this way. This is a direct quote. "I'm a journeyman filmmaker, nothing more. I make films because it is my métier. I know how to do it, and I can do a good job on pretty well everything I'm given. What I look for when I'm sent a script is something which works, or which it seems can be made to work in its own terms. Of course, if I have time, I like to work on the script to get it as close as possible to full working order, But if not, well, I just do the best I can while I'm actually directing. I don't have any particular inclination to one sort of film than another, and in my time, I think I've made practically every sort except a musical. I must admit that I do particularly enjoy fantasy. It gives one a chance to do new things, to try to be a little more subtle than almost any other sort of commercial film allows. And that would seem to jar with Hal Chester's approach to the film. He was a tough, no-nonsense, abrasive New Yorker, and Hal Chester clashed with every director he ever worked with. On Night of the Demon there was constant friction, with director and producer pulling in different directions. Hal Chester looked over Jacques Tourneur's shoulder. He made suggestions and alterations. He interfered with Tourneur's vision and arranged a rewrite of Charles Bennett's screenplay. The reason? He was aiming his film at a particular market, and he wanted it to be a success. Chester, as all who knew him would attest, was a forceful, hands-on producer, brimming with confidence, who had a very strong notion of what he wanted his film to deliver. And make no mistake, Night of the Demon was as much Hal Chester's film as it was Jacques Tourneur's. And it's become fashionable to decry Chester's involvement in the film, that he was the shallow money man who ruined a great piece of cinematic art. In truth, Hal Chester probably, and perhaps unconsciously, steered Night of the Demon to the position it occupies today as a masterwork of the horror genre. And as for his co-producer, after Night of the Demon, Frank Beavis tried his hand at several different genres. A crime drama, Death Over My Shoulder, came in 1958, followed in 1959 by the nudist camp film Nature's Paradise. And he really hit his stride when dealing with comedies, producing or working in other production capacities on 10 carry-on films, and in the 1970s, the confession sex comedies with Robin Asquith.
I guess I must have heard it somewhere. It kept running through my mind.
Tell me, what have you got in your program for the convention tomorrow?
Only a few sessions on extrasensory perception.
This moment, involving the diary, is an interesting reworking of an element from the original short story. Harrington, in casting the runes, it's learned, was anonymously sent a tradesman's calendar before his death, with everything after September 18 torn out. And it's told as a retrospective detail by Harrington's brother to Charles Dunning, who becomes John Holden in the film. Here, however, it's made into an active element within the story to directly escalate the suspense. It's another way in which some of the most chilling moments from M.R. James are reimagined for the audience to experience them firsthand, and allows the atmosphere of dread to suffuse even deeper. Back to the romantic subplot here. It's given a brilliantly sinister visual treatment, allowing Jacques Tourneur, Ted Scaife and Ken Adam to work wonders with the set and the lighting. The low ceilings to emphasize the feeling of being trapped, the candlelight making unsettling shapes everywhere, and the storm outside. The lines about the two protagonists feeling respectively hot and cold almost seem to be a sly joke about their romantic situation at this point. This section about the Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge is also another element taken from James's story. It's been edited a bit for Andrew's recitation. The section originally contained 6 lines. I'll read it, but I'm no poet. Like one that on a lonesome road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round, walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. In the story, it's again anonymously sent to Harrington as a handwritten scrawl on a Buick illustration of a man being followed on a moonlit road by a demon creature. The screenplay hasn't quite found a way to make it as threatening, but it still works rather well. Peggy Cummins was less than 10 years away from giving up her acting career in this film. She was born in 1925 as Augusta Fuller in Prestatyn, North Wales, but grew up in Dublin. She took dancing lessons at a ballet school there and made a number of stage appearances as a child. She had her first lead stage role in Let's Pretend, a London production, when she was 13, and she worked consistently on the stage in bit parts in films and on the radio throughout her teens. When she was 18, she was starring in Junior Miss in the West End, and a 20th Century Fox talent scout brought her to Hollywood. She was set for a major role in Clooney Brown, a comedy made by Ernst Lubitsch, but after testing inferior costumes, she was pulled from that production by studio head Daryl Zanuck and given the lead role in the extremely high-profile Forever Amber. However, after several weeks of shooting, Zanuck was unsatisfied with the rushes and replaced director John Stahl with Otto Preminger. He replaced Cummins with Linda Darnell, and suddenly her Hollywood career was in jeopardy. She made a number of smaller films, the most celebrated of which nowadays is Gun Crazy, the extraordinary film noir from 1950, directed by Joseph H. Lewis. She also played the female lead in Hell Drivers, the film that rehabilitated screenwriter Cy Enfield's career directly after Night of the Demon. But by 1965, she'd given up screen acting altogether. She made a number of public appearances and interviews in her later years about her career, always enthusiastic and always gracious, and passed away at the end of 2017 at the age of 92. Peggy Cummins and Dana Andrews make for a great partnership. They have real chemistry. You've got two rational people bouncing off each other like poles on a magnet. In the story, Dunning becomes quickly convinced something is wrong after unknowingly being passed the runes. Once he learns what the situation is from the late Harrington's brother Henry, it almost comes as a relief. But Holden in the film also has built an entire career as a professional skeptic and debunker. It's in his job description to ignore mind games, hucksterism, threats, and anything else day in, day out. So a great deal of the tension in transposing the story to feature length is creating a circumstance where evidence strong enough to convince him will be presented and encourage him to take the threat seriously. This is a great moment. In the story, James describes the paper's uncanny quickness in trying to escape out of the window, and it's effectuated very skillfully here. The description in the book is intriguing. A strip of paper with some very odd writing on it in red and black, most carefully done. It looked to me more like runic letters than anything else. Monster movies need a monster, of course, but it's impressive how scary a slip of paper can be made to be. The music here is one of Clifton Parker's most effective cues, adding enormously to the sense of urgency, panic and fear. What made them stop? This exchange seems to be the first time Holden takes the idea of the rune's powers seriously, and it's a key turning point in the film.
I don't know.
The Hobart Farm sequence here is one that was removed from the original 82-minute release version of the film, which is a shame, because this particular scene is very creepy. Percy Herbert, another familiar character player from films like Tunes of Glory and Mysterious Island, is a farmer out front, and Janet Barrow plays Mrs. Hobart. This is the only sequence where we actually see some of Karswell's followers, and it's an unforgettable portrait. One of the ways in which Turner, along with Val Lewton, revolutionised horror in the early 1940s was to bring it out of the Gothic castles and other outlandish fairy tale settings and into real locations that the audience would recognise, and what's more, the terrifying world on the screen is one they'd have to return to once the film was over. The strength of this scene is that it straddles both of these things. A fairly nondescript cottage next to some fields, but once Holden sees inside, it's a very different story. This is an entirely different world to the one in which he lives. He might be experienced in witchcraft, ghosts and zombies, all of the things he talked about with the press earlier, but he has never entered into an environment such as this. It's rather like a scene in a western where a stranger walks into a bar and is met with suspicion and contempt by the locals. And it's another wonderful set designed by Ken Adam. It's like something out of the Middle Ages. It hasn't moved forward. Yes, there is a light, but it looks like an old oil lamp. No electricity. These people are from a different age, but they also live in that deeper, darker world. And the dialogue is brilliant. The Hobart's phrasing is from a different era altogether. There's very much the sense of a conspiracy of silence, and the intensity with which Karswell's black magic affects his followers. Perhaps the most disturbing phrases in the sequence are his mother saying, "He was my son, and let him die." We might think This is in relation to the misfortune of his catatonic medical condition. But moments later, she dismisses him as not being a true believer. So this religion practiced by Karswell is literally causing parents to reject and indeed wish death upon children they consider not devout enough. The atmosphere in this sequence, controlled by Turner, is eerie enough, but the implications for the characters are even more chilling. The loss of it from the originally released version denied audiences perhaps the single darkest scene in the entire film. The inference is that Karswell's so-called devil cult is much larger and wider than we might begin to imagine. And just as there is Judaism, Catholicism, Anglicanism, so there is devil worship, and it's huge. This effect of Holden's vision being unsteadied we saw earlier at the British Museum as Karswell walked off. It makes you wonder if this is something that practitioners of black magic can still inflict.
Defend me from what?
And now from the Middle Ages to the prehistoric, to Stonehenge. It's like Holden is travelling backwards through time to fully comprehend what he's dealing with. When I was researching Beating the Devil, I spoke to someone at the National Trust which owns Stonehenge, and he said it's likely that Chester and Turner didn't have permission to film at the monument. They probably just did it on the hoof in an afternoon. And though it's undoubtedly the most famous stone circle in the world, scholars remain divided on its age and meaning. It's believed to have been constructed anywhere between 3500 and 2910 BC, and its much debated uses range from a place of pagan barbarity and druidical sacrifice to a geometrical astronomical tool to help worshippers celebrate the May Day festival of Beltane. For the record, there are no runes carved into any of the pillars at Stonehenge. So here we have Harvard Terrace, which is Mr. Meek's house, and we're pulling up in front of number 44. Now this is a real location in London. Mr. Meek's house is on Addiscombe Road in Watford. The house and the street are very much still there, largely unaltered. And notice that the car Joanna is in contains, rather appropriately, the number 666 on its license plate. It was owned by the English producer Frank Bevis, who offered it up as a way of further cutting costs, and it's a wonderfully serendipitous touch. Aside from the appearances of the demon, this is one of the most controversial scenes in the film. And there are some that might say that this sequence is completely out of place because it has a comic backdrop to it. Of course, we have the playing of the Cherry Ripe song, and we have Athene Seiler clucking and warbling. It's the only place that we get to see Athene Seiler really show off her comic credentials. Reginald Beckwith makes for a rather fussy Mr. Meek with his peculiar delivery, and yet again it's rooted in credibility and believability because of Dana Andrews and, to a lesser extent, Peggy Cummins. Peggy did admit to me that she got a fit of giggles while filming this scene, and it's really hard to blame her. It's also a contrast between what you might call the casual practitioners of the supernatural, as seen here, versus the more devout and horrifying, as seen at the Hobart Farm. This is a much more parochial Sunday painter type of interaction with black magic, and you really need the earlier farmhouse scene to show up that contrast. The slight absurdity of this going on around the London suburbs adds to the whole disorientating feeling. Another great British character actor, Reginald Beckwith, was born in York and worked in everything from Scott of the Antarctic with John Mills to the 39 Steps with Kenneth More, through to the James Bond film Thunderball, which was one of his very last pictures. He clocked up more than 100 film and television roles in a career lasting just over 25 years, and he died young, aged only 56. He was also a film critic, a playwright, and a BBC war correspondent during World War II. This whole sequence is one that remained pretty much unchanged through the various drafts of the screenplay from Charles Bennett's original onwards. The shifts in tone in this sequence were very carefully delineated in the shooting script. It describes this as already the scene seems to be taking on a note of lunacy. The one recording the two women singing without expression, a scene out of Bedlam. Incidentally, Cherry Ripe is a real song from the Victorian era, with the words by the poet Robert Herrick, written in the 18th century and put to music a century or so later by Charles Edward Horn. It was repopularised in World War I, but as with the decor and the small terraced house itself, it adds immeasurably to the weird Victorian tone of this setting. This scene was always a concern for the BBFC at the script stage, given the appearance of the panicked child through Mr. Meek and the fact that it's not revealed to be a hoax despite Holden's evident disdain. There was also concern from the Motion Picture Association of America when Charles Bennett's early draft was submitted to them for production code approval before Chester and Beavis entered the project. And the MPAA wrote, "We would like to direct your attention to the fact that you may very likely incur serious troubles with one portion of the script with other critical groups who will review your picture at the time of release. We refer to the scenes of the séance. While your leading man scoffs at the séance and will not accept it as credible, it seems to us that the manner in which the script is written leaves the credibility of the séance rather equivocal. If this impression should come through in the finished picture, certain religious groups will object most strenuously, and you will have on your hands a considerable problem involving public acceptability." Now, this doesn't seem to have come to pass in the American release, though being on a fairly low-profile double bill setting must have helped it avoid that kind of scrutiny. The scene implicitly also raises the question of how Julian Karswell first became involved in the supernatural. Was Mrs. Karswell involved first, and did she introduce her son into it via this spiritualism? Is this regret the cause of her actions throughout the rest of the film? She's certainly very intimately bound up with Mr. Meek and his wife here, and is very keen for Holden to likewise take it seriously. It also built to a much more wild and unhinged climax in the revised shooting script. While possessed by Harrington, Mr. Meek cries of there being fire, and then goes on, "Everything is burning. No, Karswell, you promised." The action of the screenplay then went on with, the voice ends in a wildly frenzied shriek, the shriek of death. Mr. Meek is literally foaming at the mouth, his face covered in sweat. All are on their feet. Joanna shrieks in utter hysteria. If the scene had been shot with the full intensity and gruesomeness of the scripted version, the planned dynamic of the scene would perhaps be a touch clearer and more visceral. The BBFC's report on this draft shooting script states that although the séance scene seems to be okay for an X certificate, the climax on page 84 will call for reasonable restraint. However, it's not known whether the softer version seen in the film was a decision on Turner's part, preferring his customary subtler approach to frightening sequences, or an attempt to tone it down in response to the BBFC's concerns. It could actually be both. There's no question that the content of the scene is still chilling. Something that most people miss, and certainly I missed when I first watched the film, is that what we have actually witnessed is the death throes of the poor man. That line, "It's in the trees, it's coming," was sampled and re-recorded by the singer Kate Bush for her song Hounds of Love. But it remains another indicator of the danger, the power, the mood that suffuses this entire story. And once again, we as an audience ricochet between siding with Holden and believing that this is nonsense, and siding with Joanna, who hears her uncle's voice, and the voice is that of Maurice Denham playing Harrington. And that line, "He's translated the old book," is our biggest clue yet to Karswell's power and the secret behind that power. It gives us yet another plot device and spurs on Holden to do what he's about to do, which is to go back to Lufford Hall and to break in to see that book for himself. Another murky aspect of Night of the Demons production is the identity of the film's editor, Michael Gordon. There was an English Michael Gordon who edited films at British Gaumont throughout the 1930s. His credits stop abruptly in 1939, then according to most sources start up again in 1953. What seems likely is that the Michael Gordon who emerged in the mid-50s was the blacklisted American filmmaker born in 1909, but who came to England after being named a member of the American Communist Party in the early 1950s. He came out of theatre, trained as a film editor, then began directing films in 1942. His biggest hit was Cyrano de Bergerac in 1950 with José Ferrer. He didn't direct any films between 1951's The Secret of Convict Lake and 1959's Pillow Talk, the blockbuster romantic comedy with Doris Day and Rock Hudson, but in England, Michael Gordon started to rack up several editing credits during this same period, including John Ford's The Rising of the Moon and Terence Young's Safari. So it seems likely that the credits of these two Michael Gordons have been conflated at some stage. It certainly is in character for Hal Chester to have hired someone down on their luck and needing work during this period. Now, here we are at the other side of Lufford Hall, Brocket Hall in real life, with the gate. This is the rear. If you go through those gates and drive around to the right, you're at the front of the house where Holden and Joanna originally pulled up for the children's party. Now, literally here, we're right next to the house. Holden purports to take a route through the woods to reach the house, but in reality, where they've parked is just 50 or 80 yards away from the front door. And in the press information released by Columbia in December 1956, following the conclusion of shooting, Tourneur was feted as being probably the best-known director of eerie films dealing in the occult and the mysterious. And it went on to say, Jacques was always interested in the occult and spent many years of his boyhood roaming around old empty houses in the Los Angeles area, houses which had the reputation of being haunted. I was not scared, but I was careful, said Jacques. I always took a friend and a big Alsatian police dog with me. One old house could only be reached by climbing a long wooden stairway up the side of a cliff, and after exploring the house and scaring each other half to death, the two boys decided on a nap. They were awakened by mysterious footfalls and the clanking of a chain. The sound got nearer, the boys got more scared. Jacques, greatly daring, switched on his flashlight, and there in the beam, coming slowly up the stairway, was one large Alsatian dog pulling his chain. Though we were scared, we got a real kick out of the feeling, said Jacques. So I've made a lot of pictures which scare people. They enjoy it. And lo, there happens to be a window, conveniently left open for him, possibly by Karswell himself. And in the background there is the noise of a pack of hounds, as if Karswell goes hunting like the quintessential English gentleman. We never see anything more of them. When Ken Adam designed this part of the house, it was known as the Room of Junk. I'd love to have a dig around in that room and find out what's underneath all of those sheets. Ken Adam was 35 when he got his job on Night of the Demon. He'd only recently adopted the credit of production designer, having previously been described as art director on most of his earlier films, though as he pointed out, it was much the same function. And when I interviewed him in 2001, he described his experience thus. Night of the Demon was amongst the first 3 or 4 films that I designed on my own. What happens, and I've done this all my life, is that you build the sets, choose the locations, and then you're at the studio for most of the time when the director needs you. You have to prepare locations outside, so we have an assistant art director who's on the set all the time. In 1956, I had Peter Glazier, who was probably the best chief draftsman in England at the time. It was also a significant film for me. It was certainly an interesting story and an important director. Jacques Tourneur was important and he had a good reputation. He gave me very much a free rein. We had a pleasant conference and we got on like a house on fire. And if I remember rightly, he liked almost everything I did. Coming up here is another bus scare as Holden makes his descent. In Charles Bennett's script, there is made mention of a bony leprous hand. We don't know who it belongs to. Is it Karswell? Is it the butler? Or another unknown guardian? Now, I remember watching the film as a young lad and being extremely jealous and yearning for a library such as this, or indeed a house such as this. And this sequence involving a supernatural cat may well have held a special interest for Tourneur, who was very taken with what Margaret Murray had told him when they were preparing the film. He said, "She told me a lot about cats, specifically the magic power of cats. Watch a cat. When it looks at you, it doesn't see you. She explained to me that they live in another world. When they stare at you, you have the impression that they're always looking at you through something else, never directly. It's very unsettling." And here, of course, we have the wild cat. Dana Andrews does his best, but while the one that Andrews grips to his throat is fake, there was a real one. And the leopard that we briefly see was hired from Chipperfields, the family circus that is still running today, by animal wrangler Gordon Baber, and it was needed over 2 days. The staff at ABPC Studios refused to look after it overnight, so Jack Cooper, who was Dana Andrews' stunt double, was forced to drive it home to Finsbury Park in London, and he locked it in the scullery to the surprise of his wife. And as it happens, Karswell's black cat was supplied by Jack Cooper. Some peerlessly wry delivery from Niall McGuinness here. It's Karswell who resembles the rational man, and that avuncular charm disarms Holden despite the attack from the minor demon, all very British, as if there is some normality to it. In casting the runes, there is an equivalent incident where Dunning, the John Holden character, has a physical experience of the demon for the first time. After having been past the runes in the British Museum, Dunning heads home to find his doctor coming out of his house to let him know that both his servants have been sent to the local infirmary after coming down with illness after buying shellfish from a hawker. And late that night he hears his study door opening, though no footsteps follow. Going onto the landing, he feels an unpleasantly warm rush of air around his shins. He locks himself in his room, then awakens a short time later to find the electric light has gone out. He searches under his pillow for matches, but then, as James puts it, what he touched was, according to his account, a mouth with teeth and with hair about it, and, he declares, not the mouth of a human being. It's not possible to film something felt, but not seen directly, so you wonder if this nondescript beast's mouth was the influence for the panther in this sequence here. It should be noted that this was in Bennett's earliest draft script, long before Jacques Tourneur was part of the project, so it's not some kind of nod to cat people, as coincidental as that may be. We're coming now to another of the visual effects sequences by Brian Langley and his team. Langley, John Mackie, Brian Loftus, who was only a teenager, were brought in to fix the film. So whatever it was that Hal Chester and Frank Beavis wanted to achieve, they hadn't been able to achieve it with Jacques Tourneur. Tourneur was either reluctant, or he wasn't able to deliver, or wasn't prepared to deliver, the kind of film that they had in mind. So they conceived of and brought the physicality of what we see as the demon to the screen. We're also about to see another variation on a bus shock effect with a tree branch. And it still works. There are several variations, several renditions of the demon in the final film. We've already seen the close-up of what looks to be a mask or moving head with the claw. We've seen the hoof on a stick. Now we see the fiery footprints in the sand. This is obviously a model. And we see the bubbling, which was created by the overuse of titanium chloride, which has been shot in a tank. The moving smoke is again another element. And it's the music and sound effects with that bizarre, peculiar squeaking that adds to the menace here, finished off with that strange firework effect. That sequence in the woods was one that Jacques Tourneur was most pleased with and turned out exactly the way he wanted the rest of the film to be handled. The arguments of rationalism against fear carry on throughout the film. Here it's the police adopting Holden's stance. The main actor with his hand to his face is Richard Leach. And it was Richard who confirmed to me that the film was known as The Haunted when it was being filmed. He found an entry in a diary from 1956. Richard Leach is another of the ABPC stable of actors on Robert Leonard's books. Again, one of the actors who worked on the Dam Busters. He knew Alec Guinness very well. I interviewed Richard in his house in London about this movie, and he dug out his diary to show me how many days he'd worked on the film. He didn't have a very high opinion of Hal Chester, and he related a story in which Chester was introducing himself to people on the set. He came across to Richard and said, "I'm Hal Chester. I'm the producer. Remind me, how many days are you on this film?" Almost lauding it over these lower caste players. And at one point, Hal Chester asked Richard Leach if he could borrow his coat. And it became clear that he didn't want to have Richard Leach involved on that day, either wearing the coat or holding it, because he'd have to pay him the full day rate of £25, even though he might not be acting or speaking. If he had Leach's coat, he could just pay £3 to whichever extra looked most like him from the back. Leach suspected Chester's ruse, and even that Chester would wear the coat himself to save money, and he wouldn't let him borrow it. One wonders if the fact the story branches out to include these detectives at this point is something Charles Bennett learned from all his years writing for Hitchcock. Namely, if you're really in trouble, the police won't be much help. They actually will be, in this instance, though not in the way that might be expected. This is the point when Holden's determination to hang on to his rationality and not face up to all the evidence he's seen and experienced, even in the past few hours, causes him to become not just bull-headed, but callous. First towards Joanna, in his implicit dismissal of her uncle's death and passive-aggressive accusation of her superstition infecting him, and second in the following scene towards Rand Hobart. It's a skillful bit of plotting and character work. In casting the runes, Dunning has an unswerving ally in the form of Henry Harrington, with the two of them working in absolute tandem to defeat Karswell. Here, Holden has become an isolated figure, shortly to return to his colleagues to deal with these questions academically, in the abstract, rather than what he needs to do, which is to get as practical as possible. Of course, he, as well as the audience, have no idea yet as to what the solution might be. Another deviation from the original story, where Dunning and Harrington work out the remedy quite quickly.
Mrs. Karswell plant the story about his being away. No, don't bother about him. He thinks I'm crazy anyway. I'm beginning to think so myself. Allowing myself to be stampeded like this into a state of hysteria,
I suppose you mean by me.
I didn't say you were doing it deliberately.
But that's what you meant. Good night, Dr. Holden.
Well, when your partner comes out, tell him it was just a bad Halloween joke.
In this brief scene, which is a single shot and about 40 seconds long, look at how Turner makes sure there isn't a static moment amongst the four actors. There's no cutting, and the camera only moves subtly once, but there's some element of movement on screen in a way that makes perfect sense. The movement there of the telephone was a typical Jacques Tourneur trick. He didn't just want everything to be pat. He wanted reality. And the reality is that sometimes a telephone is the wrong way around, and you've got to pull it round to be able to use it. So just another little detail that helps bring the scene to life. Here we have Rand Hobart being transported for the conference, perhaps in a slightly overdramatic fashion. Tourneur claimed to be unaware of these shots until he saw the finished film, and wasn't pleased with the ringing siren, but it provides a rather nice oral bridge into the telephone ringing. And following here is one of the most crucial scenes in the film that was removed from the shorter version. With this scene, Mrs. Carswell's intervention becomes a turning point in the movie. This brings back a theme from the Hobart farm, which is of a mother willing to sacrifice the relationship with her son in the face of this organised evil. There, it was from devotion to black magic. Here, it's a final and desperate act of love. and it's a woundingly sad finale for this character. I think it's fair to say that no one was done a greater injustice by the cuts than Athene Seiler.
Please, Julian, try to understand.
I'm afraid it's you who don't understand.
With the scene of her betrayal removed in the shorter version, this sequence, where Joanna is apparently accosted and kidnapped by Karswell outside her home, makes much less sense, with his motivation to silence her removed. As a scene on its own terms, this is a real Turner speciality, a great suspense sequence of the kind he perfected in his Val Lewton productions. A woman alone, outside at night, surrounded by shadows, whether it was in Cat People with the original Bus, the nighttime walk through the fields in I Walked with a Zombie, or the terrifying pursuit home from the store of the young girl in The Leopard Man. So the ambulance speeds through London streets and comes to this building which is known as Victoria Hall. I, along with several other people, have been trying to pin down this location for quite some time and have not been successful. It could, of course, just be a name that the filmmakers used for the film, or it could be a real name. It's superbly ironic that Holden is about to be convinced of the power of the supernatural in the most scientific setting we've yet seen, in a conference entirely made up of fellow scientists, under the strictest of clinical conditions. Even with the extraordinary sustained tension of these two final scenes, they're made up of one ingenious twist after another, and brilliantly well constructed. It's also a rather uncomfortable sequence because John Holden is using Rand Hobart to prove a point, and the point that he's proving is not to his audience or to his contemporaries. He's doing it to himself, because he's no longer sure in his own mind of what he believes in. It's fair to say that he crosses an ethical and possibly professional line in his conduct during this scene. He shows very little mercy in trying to get the information he needs, and it could be said that Holden causes Hobart's death. Of course, this may also qualify as a mercy killing of sorts. And it's our first introduction to Brian Wilde, playing the catatonic Rand Hobart. Now, Brian Wilde was an extremely well-known character actor in the UK in the 1970s and 80s. He made his biggest impression in two sitcoms, first on Porridge, where he played the rather soppy, ineffectual prison warden Mr. Barraclough, and then later in the very long-running Last of the Summer Wine, playing the rather pompous ex-army man Foggy Dewhurst. There's none of that comic ability present here. But he also made movies, such as this one, even if he isn't in it for very long. And of course, I interviewed Brian and asked him about his memories of the film. He recalled his nervousness at the scene where Liam Redmond had to pretend to inject him while using a real syringe. He remembered Jacques Tourneur as being a very calming presence on set, who also seemed to take the whole thing with a pinch of salt, at one point asking the crew, "Who's got the Roonies?" As with almost everyone else involved in the film, Wilde's memories of the movie were of it being just another job, describing it as a bit of a cattle market. One was less than the dust. If you hadn't got a big part, no one bothered much about you. Dana Andrews, however, was, he said, a wonderfully nice guy. Brilliant on set, he didn't chuck his weight about, he was humble and well behaved.
Hobart, look at this.
Within the story, this scene is also quite contradictory. For someone who claims not to believe in all of the stuff that he's debunking, John Holden is able to at least partly hypnotise this poor young man to calm him down and engage with him. The confidence in the pacing here is remarkable. We see an entire minute of screen time devoted to getting a hysterical man back under control. Most films would try and get this over with in under 20 seconds. But Turner is so confident of the spell he's casting and the underlying reality needing to be established that it's completely riveting to watch. The quality of the lighting here is another triumph for Ted Scaife. It's a combination of deep shadows and harsh electric lamplight. There's nothing calming or cosy, no gentle gradations. And compared to the extraordinary sets we saw earlier, such as Karswell's Manor or the Hobart Farm, here, apart from the backing curtain, the walls are entirely bare and stark. And in a way, this is Holden's terrain and sums up his world view quite powerfully. The clean and ordered clinical mind entirely based on facts and empirical evidence, or at least for now. We're coming up to the one cut to the finished film that was requested by the BBFC. They were always concerned about the noise and level of hysteria that Rand Hobart would display in this sequence, and initially were requested a reduction to the length and volume of his screams. However, they did relent on this, but a line of his was removed.
Only you. Hobart, what is the order of the true believer?
Those of us who believe that evil is good and good evil.
Yes, go on.
Who blaspheme and desecrate. In the joy of sin will mankind that is lost find itself again.
We blaspheme and desecrate. In the joy of sin will mankind that is lost find itself again. That line is gone from the shorter version of the film, but the same dialogue in Enfield's first rewrite of Bennett's script was even stronger. During this sequence, Hobart was originally going to say, "Those of us who believe that the Supreme One is the Lord of Hell, that evil is good, good evil," and then continued, "to blaspheme and desecrate, to perform the unholy rites on the altars of worship. In the joy of carnal sin will mankind that is lost find itself again, find power again. Praise Satan." The frank sexuality and acknowledgement of Satan here is very interesting. It also makes the attraction of Karswell's cult more easily understood. There are some very earthly pleasures to be gained. Joining the cult certainly doesn't seem to have made the Hobarts rich. It also has some even more unsavoury implications if the entire family were members. This also even more clearly shows Karswell's alignment with Aleister Crowley. Crowley is very likely to have been an influence on Karswell's characterisation, being the most famous occultist in the world, even a decade after his death in 1947. Born Edward Alexander Crowley in 1875 in Leamington Spa in England, he was the son of deeply religious parents who followed the teachings of the Plymouth Brethren. Crowley rebelled against his parents, changed his name to Alistair, and from an early age sought to live a unique lifestyle. He was educated at Cambridge, where, independently wealthy, he enjoyed the life of a privileged aristocrat and bisexual hedonist. In 1889, aged 23, Crowley joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, an occult society run by Samuel McGregory Mathers, whose members included W.B. Yeats, Algernon Blackwood, and Oscar Wilde's wife, Constance. And Crowley was expelled in 1900 for offending the order's leaders with his homosexual experiments and magical practices, after which he roamed the world. In Egypt in April 1904, he claimed to have experienced an epiphany, whereby he encountered an entity known as Awus, which he said was his holy guardian angel. Over the course of 3 days, he took dictation from Awus, and the resulting text became known in English as the Book of the Law. It would become the central work in Crowley's philosophy. One of its 3 philosophical tenets was, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," and that lasted until his death, aged 72. The similarities to Crowley are more pronounced in Night of the Demon than Casting the Runes. Karswell is certainly a mummy's boy. We don't know anything about whether he has a sweetheart, a wife, a girlfriend, but all the indicators are that he does not, or indeed, have any interest in one. And in retrospect, the moment earlier on in the film, during the outdoor celebrations, when Mrs. Karswell attempts to clumsily set up a match between Joanna and Karswell, could be seen as the first of her interventions with regards to the fate of her son. A quietly desperate attempt to get him to settle down with a nice young woman, perhaps.
Go on.
I hardly understood her, but it seems that her son is taking the 8:45 train to Southampton tonight. Would you know why?
45.
We're at the final sequence. Watford Junction is here renamed Clayham Junction. Very little of the exterior of the original railway station, as seen here, remains, although the tunnel that Dana Andrews sprints through still exists. At the other end of the tunnel, he comes out at Bricket Wood Station in Hertfordshire, about 12 miles from Watford Junction. It's used for both Holden getting on the train here and the three principals getting off again in a few minutes' time. This long platform still exists, as do the buildings that line it. The distinctive lamps are long gone, as is the clock that's going to mark the time of Karswell's death. But who's already on the train? The police. This section reminds us that Tourneur is not just a great horror director, but a brilliant maker of film noir as well. This is another very Hitchcockian motif, courtesy of Charles Bennett, the solitary man on a mission being tailed by a detective all in black. This final section is significantly more complex than in Casting the Runes. In the story, Dunning, having shaved off his beard to conceal his identity, simply waits agonizingly in the same carriage for an opportunity to return the runes to Karswell. When Karswell goes out into the corridor, his ticket case falls off the seat, allowing Dunning the opportunity to slip the runes in and offer it back. Karswell accepts and dies mysteriously on the allotted day while in France. Here we have a number of additional complicating factors. Karswell being uncertain if Holden knows whether to pass back the runes. Holden trying to bluff Karswell that he has no idea and still doesn't take the curse seriously. And the police being in hot pursuit with their own concerns about the two men. Peter Cushing always said that he wanted to play a scene on a train, and in the end he did so in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, and later again in Corruption and Horror Express. I understand what he means because there is a claustrophobia to this and a sense of forced intimacy. Karswell here is in a defensive position with his arms folded because he doesn't want to pick anything up. But he's very calm, and one has to wonder whether he expected Holden to turn up. There's also a sense of false bonhomie, that gentlemanly behaviour displayed by Bond villains as they're about to do something nasty to our favourite secret agent. And Niall McGuinness would have made a great Bond villain, such a Shakespearean baddie. This is a magnificent final scene. Far from being a blood and thunder confrontation, it instead becomes an anxious comedy of manners. And against all expectations, both leads start to underplay the scene. Politeness will win the day, which is brilliantly counterintuitive and absolutely perfect for this most British of horror films and most genteel of villains. Night of the Demon has certainly picked up a number of prominent fans and tributes over the years. Anthony Shaffer and John Carpenter have both expressed their admiration for it. Martin Scorsese recently named it as one of the 11 scariest films ever. And in Joe Dante's film The Burbs, there's a book entitled The Theory and Practice of Demonology by Julian Karswell. Sam Raimi's Drag Me to Hell takes great inspiration from this film. And other recent horror films like Ring and It Follows also draw substantially from the premise of a transferable curse. It's an evergreen basis, it seems. And so, Here's the standoff between icy intellectual superiority and sheer physicality. Holden can't outmaneuver Karswell, so he thinks, to hell with it. I'll force you to stay and face the demon too. So brute force and intimidation wins out. Then there is the level of panic and the rising tension that appears to manifest itself against a real-time scenario. The clock is ticking. We don't hear it or see it, but Holden mentions it, and it plays out on Karswell's face. And let's not forget, if Holden remains on the train, everybody on it is probably going to die. The demon will tear that train carriage apart. It will kill Holden, and most likely Joanna, the police, everybody. The enormity of it gets a little lost in the jumble of emotions and the speed of what's being played out here in this locking of horns between Holden and Karswell. But luckily, the police are here now to get exactly the wrong end of the stick and to help escort Karswell to safety, thus sealing his fate.
Your bags, sir?
My bed. Oh, yes, of course. Yes.
These are his, too. Well, you want your hat and coat, don't you, sir?
My coat? Oh, yes. Very forgetful of me. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. One note tells us everything.
You slipped them in my pocket.
The runes are being pulled along on a fishing line, of course, but the action's handled so quickly, so closely mirroring Karswell's blind panic, that it allows Turner to stage another brilliantly timed bus shock effect as Karswell starts running along the track. This section of the train line, where the climax is staged, is still there, just outside of Bricketwood Station, and runs north to St Albans. He's currently in a cutting that leads through How Wood. In terms of the film's critical reception, it didn't really have one, as almost no publications took the trouble to review it. The Monthly Film Bulletin described Turner's direction as above average, but described the end sequence as the product of a child's nightmare rather than an adult's imagination. That's certainly accurate, and perhaps an inadvertent compliment as to why the film endures. And here, in a brilliant moment, just as Karswell approaches the runes, they self-combust and disintegrate into ash. We have to presume that the clock has just struck 10. Now, the second and final appearance of the demon. We see the titanium chloride creating the demonic cloud above the train, but the furnace of the train itself was filled with oily rags and old shirts and other discarded bits to create the biggest, filthiest cloud possible in order to more smoothly add the demon optically later in post-production. You can almost see the extent of the haze that was created in some of these long shots, where it almost looks like a fog bank. The original demon models and puppets have all completely disappeared. Nothing remains other than the preliminary sketches by Ken Adam and a few workshop photos. And that's the end of Karswell, who ends up vivisected and hurled onto the track below. As well as the added demons, the film was released in both the UK and the US in an 82-minute version, shortened by 14 minutes from the version we're watching now. In the UK, it was double billed with the Ray Harryhausen adventure 20 Million Miles to Earth, but didn't do well financially. In the US, it was retitled Curse of the Demon and released in a double bill pairing with both The True Story of Lynn Stewart and Hammer's The Revenge of Frankenstein, and did much better. Although there was never a true director's cut in the way we think of such a thing nowadays, it was never really a director's film to begin with. In whatever ways Hal E. Chester and Frank Beavis may ultimately have compromised aspects of the final film, they did know a good project when they saw one, and they had the wherewithal to get some of the best work out of the creators that was ever brought forth. There is still nothing else quite like it. So I've been your host for this commentary. My name again is Tony Earnshaw, the author of Beating the Devil, The Making of Night of the Demon. It's been my pleasure and my privilege to provide this commentary on a film that remains one of my favourites, and I'd like to dedicate this to Peggy Cummins. Thank you for listening.